Memories have a funny way of staying with you. I still remember the first time I visited this mansion as a child, holding my grandfather's hand as he conducted his annual property inspection. I was 7 years old, fascinated by the huge marble columns and sparkling chandeliers. "Remember, Sophie," he'd said, his eyes twinkling, "true wealth isn't about showing off what you have. It's about using what you have wisely." 22 years later, I stood in that same grand entryway, watching my mother-in-law Diana raise her crystal champagne flute for yet another toast. "To the Winchester family legacy," she announced, her voice carrying across the marble-floored great room of the mansion. "And to maintaining our standards." Her eyes fixed pointedly on me as she emphasized the last word. I shifted uncomfortably in my simple blue dress, feeling the judgment of the entire Winchester clan. My husband Michael squeezed my hand under the table, but remained silent. We'd been married for 6 months, and his family still treated me like an unwelcome intruder in their privileged world. "Speaking of standards," Diana continued, her perfectly made-up face twisted in a subtle smirk, "Catherine, you simply must tell Sophie about the country club membership requirements. After all, we wouldn't want her feeling out of place." Catherine, my sister-in-law, jumped at the chance. "Oh yes, there's quite a substantial entry fee. But then again, on a teacher's salary, that's probably not something you need to worry about, right, Sophie?" I took a slow sip of champagne, thinking about the irony of the situation. If they only knew that the extravagant mansion they were sitting in, the very symbol of their supposed superiority, actually belonged to me. I'm Sophie Mitchell, 29 years old, and while I do work as a high school mathematics teacher, that's not my only source of income. Not by a long shot. But to understand how I ended up sitting in my own mansion while being mocked by my tenants, we need to go back a few years. My grandfather, Alexander Thompson, wasn't just a real estate mogul. He was my hero and greatest teacher. Every Sunday after my parents died in a car accident when I was 5, he'd pick me up for what he called our property tours. We'd visit his various holdings across the city, and he'd teach me about more than just real estate. "Look at the craftsmanship in this molding, Sophie," he'd say, running his fingers along the wall. "This tells a story about pride in work, about creating something that lasts." Or he'd point out a family struggling to make rent and quietly instruct his management company to give them an extension. "Business without compassion is just greed wearing a suit," he'd tell me. When I was 12, he started teaching me about finances. Not just basic budgeting, but investment strategies, property management, and the importance of discrete wealth. "Money talks, wealth whispers," became our shared mantra. He believed that flaunting wealth was a sign of insecurity, while true power lay in quiet competence. His lessons shaped me in ways I wouldn't fully appreciate until years later. When he passed away 3 years ago, leaving his entire portfolio to me, his only grandchild, I finally understood what he'd been preparing me for all along. The inheritance included numerous high-end properties across the city, including the Winchester family's beloved mansion. The Winchesters had been renting the property for over a decade, always dealing through a management company, never knowing who actually owned it. Grandfather had structured it that way intentionally, preferring to keep his tenants at arm's length. When I inherited everything, I maintained that anonymity, continuing to let the management company handle all interactions. I even kept my maiden name professionally, which made it easier to keep my wealth separate from my identity as a teacher. Then I met Michael Winchester. It wasn't at some fancy social event or high-end restaurant. We literally bumped into each other at a local coffee shop where I graded papers every Sunday morning. I was deep in a stack of algebra tests when his coffee cup tipped over, nearly ruining my students' work. His mortified expression and genuine remorse as he frantically helped me save the papers made me laugh despite myself. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying, dabbing at papers with napkins. "I was distracted by you actually. I've seen you here every Sunday, and I finally worked up the courage to come say hello. Though this wasn't exactly how I planned it." His honesty was refreshing. No pickup lines, no pretense. Just a slightly clumsy, genuinely apologetic man who'd been watching me from afar. I learned later that he'd specifically chosen this coffee shop, far from his family's usual haunts, as his personal escape from the Winchester world of pretension and social climbing. "I'm Michael," he said, still trying to salvage a particularly coffee-stained test. "And I promise I'm not usually this destructive." "Sophie," I replied, rescuing the paper from his well-meaning but increasingly counterproductive efforts. "And don't worry about it. These are just freshman algebra tests. though I'm sure Jason will be thrilled to have an excuse for his grade. He laughed, and something in the warmth of that sound made me want to hear it again. We ended up talking for hours, long after the papers were saved or surrendered to their caffeinated fate. He told me about his work as an environmental lawyer, fighting corporate polluters despite his family's disapproval of such activist pursuits. I shared stories about my students and my passion for making mathematics accessible to young minds. Not once did he mention his family name or status. In fact, it wasn't until our third date that I learned he was a Winchester. And by then, I was already falling for the man who spent his weekends at animal shelters and could quote Carl Sagan. He was different from his family, kind, genuine, and completely uninterested in flaunting wealth or status. Our relationship developed naturally, based on shared interests and genuine connection. I fell in love with the man who spent his weekends volunteering at animal shelters, not the heir to the Winchester name. When he proposed, I accepted without hesitation, but I also made a decision. I wouldn't tell him about my inheritance until I was sure his family's materialism hadn't rubbed off on him. The Winchesters, however, made their disapproval clear from the start. Diana, in particular, seemed to take personal offense at her son marrying a mere teacher. Every family gathering became an exercise in subtle and not so subtle digs about my profession, my clothes, my apparent lack of social connections. Which brings us back to tonight's dinner party, where Diana had gathered the entire family to celebrate her husband Richard's birthday. The mansion's grand dining room was decked out in typical Winchester excess, crystal chandeliers, fine china, and enough silver to fund a small country. "Sophie, dear," Diana called out, interrupting my thoughts. "Do be careful with that champagne flute. It's baccarat crystal, probably worth more than your monthly salary." Before I could respond, Richard chimed in. Now, Diana, I'm sure Sophie's doing her best to adapt to our lifestyle. Though it must be quite a shock, coming from such modest circumstances." Michael finally spoke up. "Dad, that's enough. Sophie's circumstances are none of your business." "Oh, but they are our business," Diana countered. "After all, we have a family reputation to maintain. And speaking of maintenance," she glanced around the room with a superior air, "we really must talk to the property management company about updating these curtains. They're at least 2 years old." I couldn't help but smile at that. I had actually approved those curtains myself, though Diana had no idea she was complaining to the owner. "The marble in the foyer could use refinishing too," Catherine added. "Honestly, whoever owns this place should be more attentive to these details." Michael looked uncomfortable. "The house is fine, Catherine. Besides, we're lucky to have such a beautiful place to live." "Lucky?" Diana scoffed. "We pay an astronomical rent for this property. Though I suppose to someone of Sophie's means, any rent would seem astronomical." That was it. After months of enduring their condescension, something in me snapped. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. "Actually, Diana, I'd love to discuss the rent. In fact, I just received this month's payment from your account this morning." I turned the phone toward her, showing the substantial deposit from Winchester Properties, LLC. The room fell silent. Diana's perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Well, you see," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I've been meaning to tell you all something. This mansion? It's mine. Has been for 3 years, ever since my grandfather Alexander Thompson passed away and left me his entire real estate portfolio." The silence in the room deepened. Richard's face had gone pale, while Catherine's mouth hung open in a most unladylike manner. Diana's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. "Alexander Thompson?" Richard stuttered. "The real estate mogul?" "The same," I confirmed, though he preferred to keep a low profile. Something about wealth whispering. Michael turned to me, his expression a mix of shock and amazement. "Sophie, why didn't you tell me?" I reached for his hand. "I wanted to be sure you loved me for me, not my bank account. Something your family might want to think about." Diana had finally found her voice. But you're a teacher." "Yes, I am. Because I love teaching. Just like I love this mansion, which, by the way, could use some new curtains." I smiled sweetly. "I'll have the management company take care of that right away." The next few hours were a blur of revelations and explanations. Michael, to his credit, was more amused than angry about my secret. His main concern was whether I thought he was anything like his status-obsessed family. "Never," I assured him. "Why do you think I married you?" The rest of the Winchesters, however, underwent a dramatic transformation. Diana suddenly remembered her maternal instincts, trying to backtrack on months of snide comments. Catherine became my newest best friend, and Richard kept mentioning business opportunities we simply must discuss. But the evening's most satisfying moment came when Diana tried to suggest that, as family, perhaps they should get a discount on the rent. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone again, I've been reviewing the market rates. If anything, you're paying below market value for a property of this caliber. We should discuss an adjustment. The look on her face was priceless. That night marked a turning point in my relationship with the Winchesters, though not in the way they hoped. Instead of becoming the wealthy ally they suddenly wanted to embrace, I used my position to teach them some much-needed lessons about humility and respect. First, I did raise their rent to actual market value. The extra money went directly to a scholarship fund I created for underprivileged students at my school. When Diana complained, I simply reminded her about maintaining standards. Second, I began hosting regular charity events at the mansion, inviting my fellow teachers and students' families, people the Winchesters would have previously considered beneath them. Diana was horrified, but as my tenants, they could hardly object to the owner's use of the property. Michael supported every decision, often adding his own suggestions for how we could use our resources to help others. He'd never cared about the money or status, and now he had a partner who shared his values. As for my teaching career, I kept at it, still grading papers at that same coffee shop every Sunday morning. My students never knew about my wealth, though the new scholarship fund gave many of them opportunities they'd never dreamed possible. Grandfather would have approved. His wealth was still whispering, but now it was whispering about education, opportunity, and the true meaning of value. The Winchesters still live in my mansion, though they're much quieter these days about their standards. Diana even joined the school's fundraising committee, though I suspect that has more to do with image rehabilitation than genuine charity. Last week, during another family dinner, Catherine made a casual comment about one of my cheap dresses. I simply smiled and pulled out my phone again. Speaking of cheap, I said pleasantly, have you received this month's rental invoice yet? The silence was golden.